So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Neal Graffy's love for Santa Barbara's history began at age 13 when he started doing odd jobs for Mrs. Leontine Phelan, a descendant of the founder of the Santa Barbara Presidio. Since giving his first slideshow talk on local history in Neal's not that old, 1989, he has given well over 300 presentations on 20 different topics. He has also written extensively for the Santa Barbara News Press, the Santa Barbara Independent, Santa Barbara Magazine, and numerous other local museums and historical societies. Further, his expertise has been sought out by local, state, and national radio and TV. He has been featured in several documentaries, including the Emmy Award-winning Impressions in Time, appeared on Hugh Hauser's California Gold, KCET TV's Life and Times, and on This Old House. He's also featured in a film here at the Maritime Museum called Santa Barbara and the Sea. Delightfully unfettered by convention pretty much sums up Neal Graffy's approach to history. Whether it be in print, radio, or television, or documentary, or live, his audience always find his presentations to be entertaining, fun, and educational. He has served as a board member of both the Historical Museum here in Santa Barbara and the Mission Canyon Association, as well as a member and chairman of the Santa Barbara County Landmarks Commission, among other organizations. In 2004, he founded the Santa Barbara History Consortium, a not-for-profit corporation established for the specific purpose of providing local history to a wide audience through film and video production, publishing, and oral presentations. He has authored numerous monographs for historical organizations, as well as articles in regional and national publications. I know he has a nonfiction, he has the Santa Barbara Streets. He has a fictional novel as well, based on the Potter Hotel. And not surprisingly, his hobbies include collecting Santa Barbara memorabilia, postcards, and photographs, as well as playing guitar, driving an unrestored 1941 Packard 180 limousine, and searching for the perfect bacon burger, which I know because I was leaving the habit when he was going into the habit one day. And on a personal note, I just want to say to everybody out there that I can, and I say this unequivocally with 100% sincerity, that Neal Graffy is my favorite non-female Graffy historian. So please join me in welcoming Neal Graffy.
Thank you very much, Mitch. Thank you. I'm still laughing from that. You know, usually when he introduces me, he checks to see if my sister Erin's in the room. He says, Neal Graffy is my favorite, is Erin here? My favorite historian, yeah. So well covered this time, Greg. You're running for office soon is what I am going to understand from that. Well, thank you for having me out here. I have done talks for the Maritime Museum quite a few times, and the subject of Santa Barbara's waterfront history has been done 3, 4, or maybe 5 times. Now, the museum is just coming into its 20th year, and it was in February of 2001 that I did my first talk for the Maritime Museum, so that was not long after you opened. And I did open with the history of Santa Barbara. I did it 3 months later for the docents and 2 months again after that, and each time it's changed slightly, and I have done a number of different versions of the Santa Barbara waterfront history because there is so much history and where to start. You know, everywhere you turn is perfect. Sometimes I do these chronologically. Sometimes I do them starting at Stearns Wharf and coming down to the breakwater and then further beyond up to Shoreline Park. So they all change a bit. And so this one I'm doing tonight is changed a bit. It's a potpourri of some of my favorite pieces about Santa Barbara's waterfront history, and some that I don't think have ever been covered before. And so let's see, there we go. I have to get used to which side I'm on. There we are. So I'd like to first off start with the Chumash, and the ocean front that they had here was an amazing thing. It was where they did their fishing, it's where they did their trading, and most amazing of all, the boats that the Chumash built. The boats they built are called tamals, and they are plank canoes, and this is completely unusual to any other Native American tribe in North America. I think the only ones I've seen or heard about are down in Chile. So that's a long distance from Santa Barbara, so how they did it down there, I don't know. But these craft were highly maneuverable. They were fast, they could carry a lot of cargo. And so the picture that we see here, you can see it's a plank canoe. And what they did was they waited for redwood drifting down the California coast. They would get a piece, take it to shore, they would split it using hand tools, shape the planks, then drill holes in them, lash them together with sinew, and then caulk it with asphaltum or tar, the stuff that we get on our feet at the beach. That was the super glue and duct tape of the era for the Chumash, and they use it for a lot of purposes, but mainly to get these craft, in this case, to get these craft watertight. And the craft were built by a special guild. They were called the Brotherhood of the Tamal, and from what I had found, that the last one that was built was somewhere around 1834. And when the Spanish first saw these, they were amazed. They talked about how fast they were, how maneuverable they were, and could carry anywhere from 2 to 4 to some 20 or so people. And the longest ones were 35 feet long. And they would take these out to Catalina Island, for example, to get steatite, which is a soapstone. It's a soft, carvable stone, and the Chumash could use that for heating. They could cook things in them. So it was a desired trade piece, and so they would take these all the way down to Catalina Island. And the idea of the tamals got picked up again. Around 1912, there was a man named John Harrington, and he was doing extensive research on the Chumash, and he connected with a bunch of the elders who still had the stories, they still had the songs, and still had the knowledge for a lot of the things that Chumash had done. In this case, it was a man named Fernando Librado, and he still remembered how the tamales were made. So this is the tamal that was made in 1912. Fernando Librado was said to be the last of the Chumash Brotherhood of the Tamal members. And so he sat down with Harrington, and here's the canoe that they built in 1912. And it was done again in 1976. The Chumash got together, formed a new Brotherhood of the Tamal, and they have started out rebuilding the canoes. And so far, I think 4 or 5 of them have been done. One of them, the first one that they built in 1976, is here at the Maritime Museum. And even better is they have all the different tools that were used by the Chumash to split the planks, to shape them and to sand them, and how they put these things together is just phenomenal. And so there is one today out there in the channel. It takes them, once a year they do a pilgrimage out to Santa Cruz Island, and it takes them about 10 hours to get out there. So if you get the chance, it's an amazing thing to watch. Now, we have not forgotten in our modern era the Brotherhood of the Tamal, because there is a street and a town in our county named after them. And that would be Carpinteria Street and the city of Carpinteria. And in 1769, the first Spanish expedition was coming up, land expedition was coming along the California coast. And they came into what is now Carpinteria at the mouth of Carpinteria Creek. And they saw the Chumash village there. And in the village, there was a bunch of people making these boats. And they remarked on them that this place were building all these ships. And one of them was almost finished. They're putting the last planks on it. Well, the soldiers gave the name Carpinteria, the place of the carpenters, and the name stuck. And so that's why we have that name. And we have the street because when the streets were named, that was one of the streets that led to the road that connected to Carpinteria. So when you're on that road, remember the Chumash and their boats and the carpenters that built them. This is a view of Santa Barbara in 1793, and this is the first drawing of Santa Barbara at all, either from land or from sea. And this was done by a man named John Sykes, and he was aboard Captain George Vancouver's ship. And Vancouver was a British explorer, and he was coming along the California coast and stopped in Santa Barbara, and this drawing was done. And I did a close-up there at the bottom, and you can see on the left little yellow dots. And that is the Chumash village of Suyuctun that was on the waterfront between Bath Street and Chapala Street, the Ocean and Montecito Streets. And it was a place in later days called Burton's Mound. And so that village of Suyuctun, the chief of the village was named Yanonali, and that's why we have Yanonali Street leading to the former Chumash village. In the background, you can see the Presidio, and above that, the Mission, looking quite a bit different than it does today. We've had several different styles before they got to the one that they are currently having. Well, to bring food, or not food, but to bring supplies to the missions and to the Presidios, the ships came up once a year from Mexico, and these supply ships Sometimes they didn't quite make it, sometimes they did. So just think, if you were a settler at the Presidio at the mission, whatever you had was what you had for an entire year. And if you broke it, you had to wait for a supply ship to show up, and sometimes the ships had what you wanted, sometimes it didn't. So it was a rough existence for the settlers here. Well, there was also the problem of diseases coming in. And in 1797, one of the supply ships, the Princessa, we have sort of a drawing of the Princessa there, came into Santa Barbara, and it had 34 sailors suffering from scurvy. Now, scurvy is not a communicable disease, but they wanted to be sure. And at that time, they would put people into quarantine. And quarantine gets its word from 40, and that's the standard period of quarantine is 40 days, 40 nights. And so they were put into quarantine for only 18 days. So this Quarantina hardly lived up to its name for those gentlemen. A year later, the supply ship Concepcion came into Santa Barbara, and it had 4 people aboard it that had smallpox, highly contagious. The governor of California found out about it, and he had the entire ship disinfected. It was parked off or anchored off Santa Barbara, and everybody was brought ashore, all the passengers, all the sailors, and quarantined supposedly for the 40 days. After 3 weeks, the commandant of the Santa Barbara Presidio, Felipe de Goycochea, and thank God we don't have a street named for Goycochea. If you think Micheltorena is hard to spell or pronounce, Goycochea would have driven you crazy. Well, the Presidio captain, or commandante, after only 3 weeks, let the people out of quarantine and let them board the ship and take off again. He said, the quarantine, nobody's got smallpox, it seems okay. The governor was so mad, he said, if anybody gets smallpox from these people on this ship, I'm going to hang you. Well, fortunately for us and for them, it didn't happen. So the ship sailed on, no one got smallpox. However, where the ships, not where the ships were anchored, but on shore where the people were taken for their quarantine, when they laid out the streets of Santa Barbara, one street pointed right to where that encampment was, and so that's where we get the street name Quarantina, from the sailors and passengers that were quarantined on that spot of Santa Barbara. It has been said in some of the earlier histories that the street got its name because that's where the ships anchored offshore, and a ship would not have anchored that close to the shore. They anchored about 2 miles offshore when they anchored here, because they had to be careful. If a storm came up, the winds would blow them ashore, so they had to be sure that they had enough room to get the sails up and to clear the points on either side of Santa Barbara so they could get away safely. Our next little bit of nautical history takes us to a place called the Hill of the Volunteers. And if you're looking at your photograph on the far right, you'll see a little blue feature, and it says Las Salinas, and that would be the salt pond. And today it's the freshwater bird refuge. And across from it, you can see a little brown area that I filled in there, and that would be Nidover Hill, which later became the Child's Estate, which currently is the Santa Barbara Zoo. And then next to that, between the little creek that flows there, you can see a little another brown hill that I colored in there, and it says Cerritos de los Voluntarios, and that means the Hill of the Volunteers in Spanish. And I know what you're saying. You're saying, Neal, there ain't no hill down there. I know that area. I've walked there. There's a hill where the Child Estate is, and there's a hill where the Clark Estate and Cemetery is, but there's no hill around there. Well, there is a hill. Currently, it's hidden under hotels and motels and houses and other things, but there is a hill there. And so this photograph, taken in the early 1900s, it's black and white. The hill was very hard to see, so I colored it very carefully, didn't get out of the lines, with green here to show you that hill. And at the ocean side of the hill, you can see where the cut is, and it's kind of brown there where the dirt is. And so that's the head of the hill there. Now, if you don't think there's a hill there, next time you go to the art pavilion down along the beachfront there, the Cabrillo Art Pavilion, you park in the parking lot, and then you got to walk up to the front doors. You go up a flight or two of stairs to get up there. So that shows, yes, that's where the hill is. And if you're ever in Dwight Murphy Field, you look up at where Port Lamar Street is, and you can see the slope of that hill. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, we're looking at the back side of the hill, and that's very important because it plays into our story. This is our story, and this takes us to 1818, and this is a gentleman named Hippolyte Bouchard. Now, we call him Bouchard, but it's French, so it's Bouchard. And Mr. Bouchard had been hired by the Argentine government. They were at war with Spain trying to get independence, so they hired him to take command of their ships, and his job was to attack any Spanish port, any Spanish ship, because we're at war, so fair game, go for it. So he was, some people call him, he's known in Santa Barbara history as a pirate, though he actually wasn't a pirate. He was just a hired hand. He was a mercenary, privateer, if you will. So he leaves Argentina, he lands in Hawaii, and in Hawaii he picks up a few volunteers, or he shanghais a few volunteers to help crew out his 2 ships. Sails across the Pacific to Monterey, California, and there it's under Spanish flag, so he attacks Monterey, robs, sacks, and levels the city pretty much. Heads down the coast, and he gets to Refugio, where the Ortega ranch is, the Ortega family. He pretty much torches their ranch. They fled over the Refugio Pass to Mission Santa Ynez, but he has his way with their ranch as well. But Presidio soldiers have come up, and 3 of them get captured, or 3 of Bouchard's men gets captured by the Presidio soldiers. They come back to Santa Barbara. So Bouchard sails down to Santa Barbara, or Bouchard, I keep saying the English phrase of that. Bouchard comes to Santa Barbara, sends a man ashore and puts a note down on the beachfront, and it tells the Comandante Jose de la Guerra, "Give me my men back or I will level your town." De la Guerra writes back, puts his note in the sand. Bouchard gets it, his men pick it up, take it out to his boat. And De la Guerra says, "I'd love to do that, but I got to get permission from the governor first. It's going to take several days." Bouchard says, "I don't have that much time. I want it now. Either cough up my men or I will come in and burn your town down." And so De la Guerra writes back and says, "Well, my men are just as willing to fight and die as yours are. So this is where we're at." Well, while all this is going on, Bouchard is noticing something happening in Santa Barbara. He's noticing some activity on this hill on the east side of Santa Barbara. And this is what he's seeing through his telescope on board his ship. He's seeing armed soldiers coming up over the crest of that hill that we looked at, dropping down into the lower areas, and then showing up by the Presidio. And 2 hours later, another group comes through. Bouchard has 350 men on his 2 ships. He's got 62 cannon. He can level this town, but he's seeing reinforcements coming up from Los Angeles. In reality, De la Guerra only had 50 men. So what he did was he had them come over the top of that hill, get to the bottom, change clothes, change armament, wait a couple hours, come back around the base of the hill where Bouchard can't see them, come over the top of the hill again. So Bouchard finally figures, well, you know, this might not be a fight I want to do. So they parley once again, and they decide to exchange prisoners. So Bouchard gets his men back, and he gives De la Guerra, he said, "I had prisoners from Monterey." Actually, he had the town drunk from Monterey. The only person still in the city was a guy that was not about to leave the bar because I guess the booze was free at that point. So that was not the trade that De la Guerra was hoping for, but nevertheless, that's the trade that happened. Bouchard left Santa Barbara without touching it, went down to San Juan Capistrano and had his way with San Juan Capistrano, and then sailed into history from there. But because of these brave volunteers who over and over again came over the top of that hill, it became known as the Hill of the Volunteers. So when you get a chance, look at your maps of Santa Barbara, look at Voluntario Street, the Voluntario being volunteer, and it doesn't exist today down to the ocean front, but originally, if you follow the line of Voluntario Street, it goes straight to where this hill was, and it was supposed to be named after the Hill of the Volunteers. A few street things happened over the years, so streets didn't go through exactly as planned. Like Quarantina Street does not go to the ocean still, but originally it was planned to do so. So let's move on. 10 years later, the Mexican government is now in charge of California, and at the Santa Barbara Presidio, they decide, well, we may need some protection for our harbor, such as it is. And so they put on the hilltop across from West Beach, they dig an embankment and put in a couple of cannon there to protect the harbor. So should an enemy ship land and try to bring people ashore, they can fire at them with the cannon. So that was a great idea, and it just really didn't last too long. Now, this map I'm bringing up here was done around 1840. There was a Frenchman coming through California. He wrote a book called Travels Along the Pacific Coast. And on this little map here, you can see there's a little projection sticking out into the ocean just off dead center. And in French, it says ruined battery, or a fortification that's in ruins. It also, and there's a little red sort of chevron marking where that fort is. So by 1840, this wonderful fortification they'd built was already into ruins. And it also mentions the Presidio is in ruins. The gentleman that wrote this book also noted how much gunpowder, how many cannons, each place he visited, exactly what was there. what the products were. It was a really good book about California, but it was very interesting how he really made note of how many soldiers were in each place and how much gunpowder and how many cannons and what size cannons they had. And he did remark later in his book that California could be taken by 250 well-armed soldiers. So we can see that by the 1840s, it's already in ruins. Well, a fortification like this in Spanish, as we know, a presidio in Spanish, fort is a presidio. And a small fort, a little fortification like this in Spanish, is known as a castillo. And so that is why in 1851, when the streets were named, the street that was closest to the waterfront fortification, the Castillo, got its name because that was the street that led closest to it. And in this picture, on the far left lower side, you can sort of see the fortification that was dug in the late 1820s. It was still there in the late teens, early 1920s. And when the street was led through in 1940, when they finally took Cabrillo Boulevard and knocked it through to connect to the harbor, all this got erased. But so there you can see where the little Castillo used to stand. Also at the end, on the far sort of right side of the picture, that projection sticking out there, a piece of that is Castle Rock. It was a very favorite Santa Barbara landmark, second only to the Mission for visitors and for postcards and for artists. It was a really famed spot to go. And this point was also known as Point Castillo on maps. And in the 1870s, two of Santa Barbara's legendary photographers who were starting to make photographs for tourists, I think it was Mr. Edwin Hayward of Hayward and Mazzal. He was the one who named that rock Castle Rock. And again, castle in Spanish can also be Castillo. So this Castillo has been there for some time and still was a landmark type feature. Well, these supply ships used to come into Santa Barbara annually from the Spanish government, less so under the Mexican government. During Spanish times, these settlers could only trade with the Spanish ships that came in, with the authorization of the government. A lot of smuggling was going on at that time, with ships coming in from the East Coast, going around the tip of South America into California. And the various town authorities generally turned a blind eye to it because everybody needed the supplies these ships were carrying, even though they were smuggling. Every once in a while, they would arrest the crew and they have to pay a fine. So it would look good to the Mexican government that something was going on. In the 1930s, as the Mexican government started taking over, they started loosening their laws and letting trade ships come in. And so the hide and tallow trade was a huge thing. We always hear the term hide and tallow. So what does it actually mean? Well, hide and tallow was they would butcher a cow, take the skin, and it's not that easy. They would take the skin and then they would have to treat it. They would have to scrape the hair off of it. They'd have to boil it. They'd have to leach it. They had to do all these different things. It took several weeks, if not months, to get the hides to be exactly the way they were supposed to be, then dried. And then when the ships came in to take the hides, the sailors would have to put the hides on their heads. Richard Henry Dana, that we'll meet a little bit later, he always told how his men, the men with him, always wore these thick wool caps on their heads so that the hides would not scrape their heads raw. So then taking, these several hundred pounds of hides balanced on their heads, they would have to walk through the waves to where their rowboats were waiting for them, load them onto the boats, and then go back out again. And they said oftentimes if the wind picked up, you had a sail on top of your head, and you had to fight yourself to stay upright in the water and try to get the hides loaded onto the ships. They also had tallow. Now, tallow was once they had pulled the skins off the cattle, they had to then render the fat off the cattle. And by boiling that and doing various things to it, it became tallow. Tallow was used for making candles. And since they didn't have electricity or light bulbs, candles were the lighting of the day. So that was a huge thing. They were loaded into bags that weighed 500 pounds, and two men would carry those through the surf out to the rowboats, which were then taken out to the ships and loaded on. In addition to the tallow being used for candles, it was also mixed with lye to make soap. It wasn't the greatest soap, but it was still soap. So that was the business that was going on. That was making big money for the missions so that they could get the supplies. And also the different ranchers running their cattle would also come out there. So the story is that while the ranchers are out there selling all these things to the ship's captains as they're coming in, their wives are on board the ships, looking at all the goods from Boston, from China, from the Philippines that the ships were bringing in. So it was they called them floating department stores is basically what they were. So the ranches of Santa Barbara were now in the people of Santa Barbara and throughout California, getting all their supplies from these ships from Boston. Richard Henry Dana, when he wrote about this, said it was remarkable to him that here in California, they're processing leather, selling it to us at barely anything. We're taking it all the way around the Horn, all the way back to Boston, having it made into shoes, bringing it back to California where they bought them as finished shoes, rather than having somebody in California make the shoes from the leather that's right here available to them. He could never understand that. So this is a fun piece here. This is just a few of the people that were introduced to Santa Barbara from the hide and tallow trade. And each one of these people, I think if one of them was gone, Santa Barbara's history would be completely different. Each one of these people played such a pivotal role, and it may have been such a small thing, but it turned out to be something very, very pivotal. And so at the far left, we have a gentleman, Daniel Hill. He was one of the first to come into Santa Barbara on a hide and tallow ship, a trade ship, and decide that California is a place for him. So he decided to jump ship. And so I think it was 1823 that he jumped ship. He became friends with the Ortegas at the Ortega Rancho at Refugio, and he fell in love with the Ortega's young daughter, Rafaela. And so she was somewhere around 16 when he married her, and they settled in Santa Barbara. Mr. Daniel Hill built at least 2 adobes, and at least 2 of them that I know are standing. One is the Hill Carrillo adobe on Carrillo Street. It's still there and in beautiful shape. It's half the size it originally was. His other adobe was out in Goleta on La Patera Lane, still standing. Mr. Hill also got a rancho. It's called the Rancho La Goleta. And in Spanish, a goleta is a schooner. And so his rancho was the Rancho of the Schooner. So how did it get that name? Well, that deals with our next gentleman, William Goodwin Dana. William Goodwin Dana arrived in Santa Barbara 2 years after Mr. Hill decided California was the place for him. He also jumped ship and met the beautiful daughters of Carlos Antonio Carrillo. And so he married one of the Carrillo daughters. Mr. Dana became the captain of the port in Santa Barbara, which was a great position to have. It's going to be very important for him and for Santa Barbara. He also got the Rancho Nipomo, which if you head up to San Luis Obispo, you know where Nipomo is, and his adobe is still up there as well. Now, how Mr. Dana figures into this Goleta story is because he hired the next gentleman over, Benjamin Foxen, to build him a ship. Now, the ship was being built about where the sand spit is for Goleta, somewhere along that Goleta shore, just about where the gas plant is, somewhere where the beach and the gas plant, that low area. Benjamin Foxen built a boat. Now, there's many versions of the story. Either there was wrecked schooners out there already, and he was fixing them up to make one boat out of them, or he built a brand new boat. But either way, Benjamin Foxen built the boat there, and so the area became known as the place of the schooner or the Goleta. And so that's where Goleta gets its name from, because he built the boat, the Goleta, and Daniel Hill named his ranch after that. So without that, who knows what Goleta would have been called. Now, Mr. Foxen was another person that came into Santa Barbara on a trade ship and was doing business up at the San Isidro, what's now the San Isidro Ranch, saw the owner's daughter, fell hopelessly in love with her, and the salt water drained from his veins and became a landlubber. He opened a store on the Santa Barbara waterfront and then eventually built an adobe and got property back in the Santa Ynez Valley. So we have from him the name Foxen Canyon, and of course, without him, we would not have the wonderful Foxen Canyon wines that I'm going to enjoy after our talk tonight. The next gentleman to the right is Mr. Thomas Robbins. He came in aboard, he actually was on the same ship that Daniel Hill was on, but it took him several years before he made up his mind to move into Santa Barbara. He too married the daughters of Carlos Antonio Carrillo. Now back then it wasn't that easy to just say, I'm going to marry this woman. You had to first become a Catholic, you had to become a Mexican citizen, and you had to learn the language. Now, there's always the discussion about what's the best way to learn a language, whether it's through immersion or just taking it a bit at a time. Well, when nuptials are on your mind, you learn really fast. And so these gentlemen learned their Spanish, became Catholics, became Mexican citizens, and then were able to marry into these. Of course, that is if her brothers, her father, and all of her uncles and nephews agreed that you are worthy of marrying the girl. So he too married one of Carlos Antonio Carrillo's daughters. He ended up with several land grants. One of them is now known as Hope Ranch. And when they named the streets in Santa Barbara in 1851, the street that led out of Santa Barbara to the road that went to his place out on his ranch, which is now Hope Ranch, they named Robbins Street. So that's how we get Robbins Street, named after our former sea gentleman, Mr. Thomas Robbins. On the lower left, we have Nicholas Den. He was a late arrival coming into Santa Barbara. He was an Irishman. He was partially trained as a doctor. So when he found Santa Barbara and decided to move here, he more or less served as the town's doctor. Despite whatever limited education he had in his doctoring, he became more or less the town's doctor. He applied for a land grant, and he got a place called Rancho dos Pueblos outside of Santa Barbara. He also fell in love with Daniel Hill's very young daughter. And so everybody was 16 when they got married back then. Sweet 16 was the thing. No matter how old these guys were, all these girls seemed to be 16. So Nicholas Den married Daniel Hill's daughter, moved out to the Rancho dos Pueblos. He also had an in-town house on Figueroa Street in State. He had his adobe there. So Nicholas Den's Rancho dos Pueblos kind of figures highly into our story because it's many years later that a man named William Wells Hollister is driving sheep. He brought them from Ohio out to Santa Barbara and was heading up to Northern California to sell them to the miners and to make money. He passed through Rancho dos Pueblos and thought it was the most beautiful place he'd ever seen and vowed he would come back here and buy property. And so years later, he did come back and buy property. So without Nicholas Den having the property ready for him, probably never would have happened. And Hollister figures heavily into so much of Santa Barbara's history. The gentleman next to him, Alfred Robinson. Alfred Robinson was the agent for one of the hide and tallow companies, the Bryant and Sturgis Company of Boston. Alfred Robinson, also coming out to California, met a most beautiful girl, the daughter of Don Jose de la Guerra, named Anita de la Guerra. And they got married. She was sweet 16. He's in his 30s. And it was just so happened that when he was having his wedding, the ship Pilgrim, a hide and tallow ship, was in town, and a young man named Richard Henry Dana, we've mentioned before, was aboard the ship and wrote the story, having observed the wedding, wrote the whole story about it. And it became one of the great classics of California history as well as Santa Barbara history. And Mr. Robinson is, I think he passes out of our picture from there. Next to him is Captain Alpheus B. Thompson. He was known as a China trader, which meant his ships were going not only just to California, but across the Pacific to the Philippines and to China. And he became very wealthy, very well known, a very able ship captain. And he came out to Santa Barbara also as one of his many stops. Fell in love with the daughter of Carlos Antonio Carrillo, so another one, number 3 of his daughters married into the new hide and tallow captains coming out here. Mr. Thompson built a 2-story adobe at State and De La Guerra streets, and that 2-story adobe, well, it was torn down around 1909, but as a 2-story adobe with railings around the top of it, it has what people have called the Monterey style of architecture. But actually, he built it before Mr. Larson up in Monterey built his adobe. So technically, what's called the Monterey style of architecture is truly the Santa Barbara style of architecture, as Thompson had it first. Whether they borrowed the ideas from each other, nobody knows, but Mr. Thompson wins the prize for that. And then finally, I have Richard Henry Dana. Richard Henry Dana was a young graduate from Harvard. He was in ill health and bad eyesight, so he decided the best way to cure that was to sign on to a hide and tallow trading ship coming out to California. When you read this book 2 years before the mass that he did, it is an incredible picture of what life was really like on a ship back then. Men being punished, whipped, tortured, falling off of a mast. And it was nothing like, oh, you've never worked on a boat before, so we'll give you a break, you'll learn the ropes. First day on the job, he's climbing up a mast, getting completely tarred from all the pitch that's on there. There was none of this, well, you'll learn the ropes eventually. It was do it or there was no other choice. You just did it. So these are the gentlemen that I find very interesting for Santa Barbara history, and we could do an hour on each one of these gentlemen. Which brings us from these gentlemen to the next wave that came out, the Otter Hunters. These men were trappers and hunters. They came across the United States to California. Isaac Sparks, for example, came into California, got arrested because he was a foreigner without a passport. He came up to Santa Barbara and realizing that the otter was big money out here because the princes back in China they loved these otter coats. They were just amazing coats, and they fetched big money. So otter hunting was a very lucrative trade at that time. So Isaac Sparks, great hunter, he applies to the captain of the port, William Goodwin Dana, that we just met in our previous slides, and he grants him a license to hunt otter. So now Isaac Sparks can stay here legally. Isaac Sparks builds a beautiful brick home on Lower State Street, one of the first brick houses in Santa Barbara. He's also the third mayor of Santa Barbara, and he gets a ranch up in San Luis Obispo called the Wasna Ranch, and part of it is still up there in the Sparks family descendants. Sparks also has the notoriety. He was given the task of removing the Indians from San Nicolas Island, I think in 1835. And they had to remove the Indians from the island because the Alaskan Indians that were out in the channel hunting otter were killing all the men on the island and raping all the women, and so for their protection they decided to remove all the natives off the island and keep them away from the Alaskan Indians. So Sparks was given the task of getting a boat out there, which he did, and one woman got off the boat, and it pained him for years that he was never able to go back and pick up this woman that stayed on the island. And we know her today as the lone woman of San Nicolas Island. Juana Maria was her name. And so Sparks always felt bad about that. He had to leave because a storm was brewing up and they would never get off the island, so he took off without her. The next gentleman, George Nidever, came into Santa Barbara, also as an otter hunter, and he got a piece of property on the beachfront, later known as Burton's Mound, and lived up there. Mr. Nidever gets his notoriety because he was the man who found the lost woman of San Nicolas Island. In the 1850s, he was out on the island, saw the footprints, so someone was alive out there. He came back the following year, and they saw the woman, and they finally convinced her to join them, and they were still camped there for several months, and they brought her back to Santa Barbara. And sadly, she died not long after she got to Santa Barbara. They said the rich diet that she was getting was what did her in. And the final gentleman to the right, Lewis T. Burton, another hunter that came here, another otter hunter. He also married Carlos Antonio Carrillo's daughters. Actually, he married two of Mr. Carrillo's daughters. One passed away, so he then married her sister. So we have those three otter hunters. Mr. Burton also became the first president of the Common Council of Santa Barbara, which was almost like being mayor, but slightly different. And Mr. Burton also bought the property on the beachfront that later became known as Burton's Mound between Chapala, Bath, Montecito, and the oceanfront, and later our Potter Hotel will be built upon that. In addition to these three gentlemen, there was one more guy that covers both of these topics, hide and tallow as well as otter hunting, a gentleman named Alan Light. Alan Light was a cook aboard the Pilgrim, and when it was in Santa Barbara, he jumped ship. The Pilgrim's captain was just a real mean guy, and actually he was the brother of Captain Alpheus Thompson that we saw earlier. So the captain was pretty mean and cruel, and Alan Light decided he'd had enough of it, so he jumped ship in Santa Barbara and was immediately taken in by Isaac Sparks and George Nidever. And they named him Black Steward because, one, he was African American, and since he had been the cook on the ship, he was the steward, so his nickname became Black Steward, and that's pretty much what people called him. We have no photograph of him, but in San Diego, they were doing some work on an old adobe, and they found paperwork. He had owned this building, Mr. Light, in San Diego at one time. They found the paperwork that was his sailor's protection papers. Because he was black, sailors or people that were freemen would often get this paperwork saying that this is a free man. It gave him a description, his height, et cetera, et cetera. So this was his papers, and they were still found many years after he had moved out of the adobe. So Alan Light stayed in Santa Barbara for many years. He was the second, I believe, African American to settle in Santa Barbara. He was an expert marksman, which is why Nidever and Sparks had him come along with them as their partner doing otter hunting and shooting. He also got the job from the Mexican government of protecting the waterways off Santa Barbara from illegal otter hunters. So he had a full job coming out here doing that. He eventually moved to San Diego, opened a business down there. I think he had a tavern or a bar. And I lost track of him after that. He went up to the gold fields, and so that was the last that I have heard so far of Alan Light, also known as the Black Steward. Well, Santa Barbara is now booming slightly. Things are happening. The gold rush has happened. The Mexican-American War ended. Many of the soldiers that came out here from New York, by ship, of course, arriving here on our waterfront, found California to their liking, and they stayed behind. The gold rush happened, brought many people out to California. They stayed behind, so Santa Barbara's population is starting to increase. And we are now needing goods and commodities that we can't get and produce locally, so it's coming in by ship. Well, the only way to get it here, ships have to anchor again about 1 mile to 2 miles offshore. The goods are put onto a small boat, a skiff or a lighter as they called it, and rowed ashore. Heavy items like lumber was simply just tossed overboard and floated ashore. And so if you were a lumberman, you had to pick up your lumber along the beachfront. Wait for it to float ashore. It could take a couple days. It could take who knows how long. So that's how goods got here. It also costs a lot because the ships coming up from coming around the tip of South America would go to San Francisco and unload in San Francisco. That products was then put onto another ship, brought off to Santa Barbara, then offloaded onto these skiffs, but also cost more money to bring them to Santa Barbara. So it was very expensive to get stuff in Santa Barbara, and as people say, it still is today, but it was expensive back then. So finally, a group of people decided to do something about that. A man named Samuel Brinkerhoff, from whom we have Brinkerhoff Avenue, he decided to form what's in Spanish here, the Compañía de Mula, if I'm pronouncing that right perhaps, de Santa Barbara, which is the wharf company of Santa Barbara. So at the foot of Chapala Street, they built a wharf, and it was actually, two of our Otter Hunters, Mr. Sparks and Mr. Nightover, were partners with him on this, as well as several other people. So they built this wharf at the foot of Chapala Street, but it was only 500 feet long. That's just a little more than a city block long. It wasn't going far enough out for the ships to tie up to. That was still too shallow water. So the problem was that now goods, when you bring goods into Santa Barbara, you can bring it up towards that wharf if you have a small enough ship, but still it's got to be offloaded. But mostly, once again, it was put onto the small skiffs. They rowed it up to the wharf, and then it had to be brought on. Well, to get onto the wharf, you had to climb the ladder. And as you're sitting there, you're bouncing up and down in the waves at the tip of the wharf. The ladder is wet, and so you're trying to get goods and bring them up there. One of the Los Angeles newspapers made a mockery of Santa Barbara's highly newly efficient wharf because it said, first off, you're going to get into the rowboats, and as the sailors are rowing you up to the wharf, you've got to be dodging the oars as they're rowing, and people are getting smacked in the head. Once you get to the wharf, you've now to climb over all the baggage and try to get to the ladder, hold on to the ladder, and climb the ladder. And no self-respecting woman is going to climb that ladder and let a sailor look up her dress and see her ankles and stockings. It just wasn't done. So in spite of Mr. Brinkerhoff and his companion's wharf, most people considered to just get rowed ashore, like these gentlemen are getting here. However, as you're being rowed ashore, just where you get to where the waves are starting to go up and get ready to break, the sailor would turn to you and ask you for a tip. If you didn't give him a tip, it wasn't his fault, as in this picture. The skiff turns sideways in the waves, and you and your family and all your belongings get tossed overboard. So that was no way to bring people into Santa Barbara, and a lot of people were upset. The town was upset about it. The tradesmen were upset about it. The passengers were upset about it. So this horrible Roe versus Wade controversy was not settled by the Supreme Court. No, it was settled by this man, a former district attorney, John Peck Stearns. John Peck Stearns was out of Vermont. He came to California for the gold rush and realized that standing in freezing cold water was not a best way to find your riches. So he moved to Santa Cruz, California, became a school teacher, and then became an attorney, and then became district attorney. Somewhere with that great background, he decided he'd rather be a lumberman. So in 1867, he moved to Santa Barbara and opened a lumber yard. Well, he got tired of having to pick up all of his lumber up and down the coast like that. So he approached the people that owned the Chapala Street Wharf and said, hey, why don't we extend this further out into the ocean? I'll pay the money to add the extension. They said, no, we're not interested. And he said, you know, this is ridiculous. We can't offload our lumber or get goods on here. And so they still refused. So he turned to the town's leading citizen and the wealthiest citizen, Colonel William Wells Hollister, borrowed $41,000 from Hollister, and built what became known as Stearns Wharf. And this wharf went out 1,600 feet out to sea, and then another eventually 2,200 feet. So now ships could tie up easily to the wharf, offload lumber, offload passengers, and you can see by comparison the stubby little Chapala Street wharf next to that. The first ship tied up at Stearns Wharf on September 16th, 1872, so we were in the anniversary year of Stearns Wharf opening. And the first ship was the Annie Stauffer, and it unloaded several 100,000 feet of lumber. In 1872, Santa Barbara was just at this amazing pivotal time. A man named Charles Northrup had written a book called Seeking Health in California, and it was all about the wonders of California, and in it he mentioned that Santa Barbara was among the best place for health seekers, because here you can choose your climate. You can have a dry climate, you can have a wet climate, and it's always warm and it's great. So Charles Nordhoff's book gets published, people are looking at California, and John Peck Stearns opens this wharf just in time to receive the new visitors coming into Santa Barbara for their health seeking. And so here we can see a picture of the lumber. There's 3 lumber schooners tied up there with several 100,000 feet of redwood, which is going into building Santa Barbara's homes, starting to build our new hotels. There's a ship just pulled in from the Pacific Steamship Company, unloading passengers. And this is the look down the wharf towards what Santa Barbara looked like around 1875, 1876. So it was perfect timing. As we say, John Peck Stearns opened the door for Santa Barbara. In our next shot, we have a very rare picture of the 2 places together. You can see Stearns Wharf and a little Chapala Street Wharf stubby thing behind it. The Chapala Street Wharf died in around 1878. There was a storm at the early part of the year. A ship lost its mooring, crashed into the Chapala Street Wharf, tore a good part of it down as it was being tossed and bashed by the waves. In turn, all of that went further down the coast and hit Stearns Wharf and took out about 1,000 feet of Stearns Wharf. That was a major part of the wharf. And Stearns did rebuild. Actually, he was really mad because the county had fined him, or told him he needed a tax of $50 a year for his wharf, and he refused to pay it. And so when the wharf was broken with a 1,000-foot gap in it, he said, I'm not going to fix it until you take away that $50 tax that you put on me. So the county finally rescinded and took the tax away, and Stearns rebuilt the wharf, put the 1,000 feet in. However, once again, at the end of the year, on December 31st, 1878, another storm hit Santa Barbara, and this time we had a tornado. You think about Santa Barbara, not a place you'd think to have tornadoes, but we got a tornado that year, and it took out another 100 feet or so of Stearns Wharf. He went back and rebuilt it, and the wharf was going back into business again. Well, Stearns is also getting, by this time, a lot of competition. There's now 7 or 8 wharves along the Santa Barbara County coast, up in Lompoc, up in Point Saul, up at Gaviota, up at Goleta at Moore's Landing. And so Stearns is getting some competition, but he still has the best and the deepest wharf around. Well, 1887 rather, the railroad comes to Santa Barbara, and so now goods can come up from Los Angeles by rail. And so Stearns has got some competition for goods coming here. So what he builds is in 1888, he adds a Y to Stearns Wharf, and you can see it in this picture here, extending over to the shoreline. And so this was that rail cars could now come directly out onto the wharf, pick up lumber or goods from the ships coming in, take the rail cars back to the main line and take them to wherever they have to go. Or, in many cases, goods coming from Santa Barbara coming in by rail could then be loaded onto the wharf, loaded on the ships and taken off. So Stearns kept up with the competition. The Railroad Y lasted until the 1920s, and that's where this picture is taken. You can kind of see it's sort of kind of falling apart there. But the one stub that remains is still with us, and that's where the Sea Center is. The Natural History Museum Sea Center is on that stub right there. So the wharf continued to change as the times changed. And it went from a lumber wharf primarily, and the lumber industry died down. It went to a fish processing and fishing wharf. It also went for when the oil wells were in the channel, it became an oil storage and oil for loading the workers to get out to the oil channel, out to the derricks out in the channel. So the wharf has always changed and kept up with whatever Santa Barbara was going through. And amazing that it has stayed out as long as it has, especially because there was also the famous fire at the Harbor Restaurant, which torched the wharf so bad it was closed for almost 8 to 10 years. And it was finally a bunch of different ideas came up as to what to do with the wharf, including tear it completely down, build a stone jetty that came out instead. There was all these different plans. And there was a young city councilman named Hal Conklin who finally worked with all the different agencies to say, let's get this thing back together again. And so the wharf was finally rebuilt and opened again, I think, 1981. And then there was another fire a few years later. The Sea Center caught fire, but that was repaired. So the wharf has had damage from storms, damage from ships running into it, and it still has problems. Here's a high tide coming in, and every once in a while we get those big tides, and there's people in this case standing out on the wharf as these big waves are just crashing over the far end of it. But probably the worst danger that Stearns Wharf has ever faced came in 1966, and it came so close to being completely destroyed. And I'm sure some of you remember that day because you were there. The Joker tried to destroy the wharf. Thank God Batman and Robin were there to get the bomb and get it off the wharf so that there was no damage to Santa Barbara. Well, the wharf has changed over all these years, from starting off as a lumber and passenger processing to oil production to fishing to abalone, and now it serves over a million, well over a million tourists and locals a year coming out to enjoy what it brings to Santa Barbara. And I just like this particular shot here. It just shows how much is going on along that wharf, which still owes its roots out to John Peck Stearns in 1872.